established both the demand for purple and how the dye was produced, we can turn to the central case study, the city of Meninx. Meninx was located on the Tunisian island of Djerba, known in antiquity as the island of lotus eaters, the same island encountered by Odysseus during the Odyssey. Meninx was the largest city on Djerba and in fact one of the largest cities in southern Roman Tunisia. And this is remarkable because the conditions for settlement there were far from ideal. Although Meninx was located on the coast, it did not function as a productive harbor city. In fact, access to the city was notoriously difficult. The coastline around Djerba is extremely shallow. Large ships could only reach the island through the Bugara Gulf, where a narrow strait leads to the southern coast. Now you can clearly see this as the opening of those two landmasses and the different streams of colored water. Those are the only deep parts through which you can travel. And this passage constantly shifted with the seasons and thus required experienced navigators to cross safely. The island also offered very limited agricultural potential. Djerba had a largely arid climate, supporting mostly and mainly olive cultivation, while only small amounts of wheat could be grown. So, why was the city founded in such an unfavorable location in the first place? And how did it develop into one of the largest cities in the province? The answer becomes abundantly clear when we look at the landscape just outside of the city. Across an area of roughly 10 hectares, enormous heaps of Murex brandaris and truculus shells cover the landscape. These deposits are so vast that they can even be clearly seen on satellite images. These shell dumps have reshaped the once flat terrain into hills of mollusk remains. They provide a striking testament to the reason Meninx was founded here. Because the same shallow gulf that made navigation difficult was in fact an extremely productive spawning ground for Murex, making it an ideal environment and location for purple dye production. These hills that you see here would have been much bigger in the past, as according to the local archaeologist there, Semi Tahar, almost more than half has been reused over the centuries for laying roads on the island and across the island and building roofs. In the site itself, well, the site itself is dominated by the industry. Crushed shells are visible throughout the city and numerous dye workshops have been identified. In addition to this, many kilns have been found with burnt crushed Murex shells inside of them. Now this, as the Romans saw an innovative opportunity for reusing the shells high in their calcite content. The shells could be burned to produce lime, a crucial ingredient in Roman mortar. According to Vitruvius, well-tempered lime was one of the most essential components in Roman construction. The abundance of Murex shells thus provided a valuable and easily accessible source of high-quality lime, allowing Meninx to repurpose their industrial waste into a crucial building material. Purple production in Meninx originated during the Punic period. The earliest large-scale deposits of discarded Murex shells date to the late 4th century BCE. Already during this period, the city appears to have accumulated considerable wealth, allowing it to expand while exploiting its nearby limestone quarries. Although little is known about the character of the city during this period, we do know that Meninx became involved in the events of the First Punic War. This, as the Romans intended to plunder or potentially even sack the settlement during the conflict. However, because of the shallow waters that I've described before surrounding the island, Roman ships actually ran aground near the entrance of the strait. As a result, Meninx emerged from the episode largely unscathed. But again, it's a testament to how difficult the site was to reach for large ships. Although already a wealthy city, Meninx would experience its most dramatic growth after its incorporation into the Roman Empire. The first major phase of expansion occurred between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. During this period, the city began to develop into its first wave of monumental architecture. A forum was constructed and earlier Punic settlements were leveled to make room for Roman buildings. Several temples dedicated to Roman deities were erected, incorporating terracotta decorations imported from central and southern Italy, to adorn the locally quarried limestone structures. This wave of construction suggests a flourishing economy during this early Roman period. Meninx reached its height of its prosperity, however, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, when it became one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Roman North Africa. This expansion was accompanied by a major urban redesign, aimed at increasing the efficiency of the purple dye industry there. The city's layout was deliberately reoriented towards the sea. In the early to mid-2nd century CE, the main road was realigned to run parallel to the coastline. Along this road, Lord's Harea warehouses were constructed to support the industrial district. To supply the zone with water, 6 large cisterns were built, providing fresh water necessary for dye production. And you can see a part of this main road right over here with the cistern right in front of you to the right. In effect, the entire coastal zone of Meninx was reorganized to serve the needs of the purple industry. Archaeological evidence clearly reflects the success of these measures. The enormous accumulation of Murex shell deposits in the city's hinterland indicates a substantial increase of production during this period. The wealth generated by this expansion of the purple industry triggered an extraordinary wave of monumental construction during the 2nd and early 3rd century CE. Along the coast, several temples, large baths complexes, and a theater were constructed, all oriented towards the sea in a clear acknowledgement of the importance of the city's prosperity. The forum was also completely redesigned. It now incorporated multiple temples, extensive portico, and a basilica. Notably, these monuments were no longer built from locally quarried limestone, but from luxurious imported marbles, including Pentelic, Tunisian and Cipollino Rosso marble, as well as the imperial porphyry. The quality of these architectural carvings was exceptionally high, even surpassing that of some imperial-funded monuments in Carthage constructed during the exact same period. This suggests that the local elites of Meninx had access to enormous wealth, which they reinvested in the urban landscape. Given this visible prosperity, it may seem surprising that Meninx was almost entirely dependent on imports. The land surrounding the city consisted largely of salt flats. While they were ideal for providing the salt used in purple production, they rendered the land largely infertile. As a result, the city could produce very little food locally. The only significant local food industries were related to the sea, particularly fishing and the production of gar. Although some olive oil, wheat, and wine were produced elsewhere on the island, the majority of food required to sustain the city's population had to be imported, primarily from the North African mainland. Wine was even imported from regions such as Italy, Greece, and southern Gaul. Even more striking is the evidence that basic goods, such as ceramics, which could easily be produced on the island of Djerba itself because it has huge clay reserves, were also imported, despite the fact, of course, that the pottery could have been produced locally. Now, this suggests that Meninx's reliance on imports went well beyond luxury goods such as wine and marble. Now, the explanation likely lies in the profitability of the purple dye industry. The profit generated by purple production may have been so substantial that it became economically more advantageous to concentrate labor on this single activity while importing many other goods. In effect, Meninx thus developed a highly specialized economy, centering almost entirely on purple dye production. As a major center of purple production, Meninx appears to have operated with a broader regional production network. Large quantities, as I've mentioned, of wool were required for dyeing. A significant portion of this wool was produced on the island itself, as Djerba maintained a substantial population of male sheep throughout the entire period of Meninx's habitation. However, local supply was insufficient on its own, and additional wool was important from the adjacent mainland. The nearby city of Djiktis, located roughly 30 kilometers away, appears to have played an important role in this production chain. Inscriptions attest to the presence of fulleries there, and the city's 2 large wadis would have provided abundant water for washing wool before dyeing. The industry likely generated considerable wealth from Djiktis as well, making it the 2nd largest city in the region. Other settlements also contributed to the industry. Significant deposits of Murex shells have been found at the sites of Gizeh in the north of Djerba and at Higeburgu, indicating that snail harvesting occurred in these locations as well. My own fieldwork and scouting of Jictis has revealed substantial deposits of Murex shells and the use of Murex-based mortar in various structure, suggesting that the city may have been engaged in snail harvesting as well, or even small-scale dye production. Meninx's purple industry and its associated production network continued to thrive throughout the first half of the 3rd century CE. The city appears to have done so well in this period that the members of their elite were able to play a major role in the unstable political climate of the crisis of the 3rd century. This, as the city of Meninx delivered an emperor of their own, Aemilian, in 253 CE, who had been able to grow into one of the most powerful generals of the empire. Despite the larger and despite the broader instability throughout the empire, Meninx itself appears to have remained economically strong. Significant changes only appear during the reign of Diocletian. At this point, monumental construction in Meninx abruptly ceases, even though purple production itself appears to have increased. The Murex waste dumps outside the city grew dramatically, and by the 4th century CE, shells were even being stored within the urban center. Houses and temples were repurposed as storage spaces, while kilns were constructed within the city itself to burn the enormous quantities of shells. What caused this abrupt change? A possible explanation can be found in the Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman register of imperial offices. In this document, a procurator is mentioned who was responsible for the direct supervision of the dye workshops at Meninx. Since Diocletian made a deliberate effort to monopolize purple dye production in cities such as Tyre, it seems very likely that the workshops at Meninx were also brought under imperial oversight, either by Diocletian himself, seeing that the stagnation of the city emerged under his reign, or by one of the emperors who continued these policies before the Notitia was compiled around 402 CE. Under imperial control, the primary objective appears to have been maximizing production, regardless of the impact on the urban environment. Settlements that had previously thrived on private Murex production, such as Gizeh, Zita, and Jictis, witnessed immediate decline, with all of them being abandoned between the late 3rd and 4th century CE. The only settlement to remain viable alongside of Meninx was the nearby port city of Gualala, where ceramic production emerged, indicating that Meninx's wealth had diminished to such an extent that the long-distance import of ceramics was no longer sustainable. Purple production in Meninx nevertheless continued through the 4th and 5th centuries and even into the Vandal period. By this time, however, much of the city had already been abandoned, even as the industry itself continued. The industry ultimately came to an end in the 6th century CE, when the Byzantine reconquest repurposed the site into a defensive position. Now, the case study of Meninx demonstrates clearly how deeply the purple dye industry could shape a Roman city. Purple production was not simply an economic activity carried out within the city, it structured the city itself. The rise, decline, and eventual fall was directly connected to the demand of purple on the private market. Even without seeing the workshops itself, the presence of the industry is visible throughout the urban landscape. Vast Murex shell deposits accumulated in the city's hinterland, and crushed shells were incorporated in building materials throughout the settlement. The coastline was lined with workshops, and the profits generated by the industry were reinvested into monumental architecture, transforming Meninx into one of the wealthiest cities of Roman North Africa. This wealth did not remain confined to the city itself. The surrounding region became deeply integrated into the production process. Large quantities of wool had to be supplied, and nearby settlements became involved in different stages of the chain abattoir, particularly wool processing and the harvesting of Murex shells. In this way, the purple industry created the regional economic networks centered on Meninx. In many respects, this reflects patterns observed in other purple-producing cities around the Roman world, which I looked at in my thesis. Cities such as Tyre, Sidon, Sabrata, Berenike, and Tarentum all benefited enormously from the industry. Yet these cities still fit comfortably within Mattingly's model of the Roman urban economy. They possessed fertile agricultural hinterlands and which remained the foundation of their economies, while purple production formed an important but not exclusive sector within this broader economic system. Meninx, however, presents a different picture. Unlike these other cities, Meninx lacked a fertile agricultural hinterland capable of sustaining a large population. Much of the surrounding landscape consisted of these salt flats, ideal for dye production but unsuitable for agriculture. As a result, the city became heavily dependent on imported goods, including basic foodstuffs and everyday materials such as ceramics. This suggests that Meninx developed an unusually specialized economy. Rather than maintaining a diversified economic base, the city focused overwhelmingly on a single, extremely profitable industry, the production of purple dye. The immense value of this product allowed Meninx to sustain itself by importing goods that other cities would have normally produced locally. As long as the industry remained in private hands, this specialization appears to have worked remarkably well. The high value of purple dye provided strong incentives for merchants to visit the city, bringing with them food, wool, and other supplies. In this way, Meninx became deeply integrated into the wider commercial networks across the Roman Empire. This integration depended heavily on the stability provided by the Roman imperial system. Large-scale import dependence required reliable trade routes and predictable deliveries. For a city like Meninx, delays in shipment could have been disastrous. Wool was needed to sustain the dye production, and food imports were necessary to support the urban population. And it was precisely this dependency that made Meninx vulnerable. When the purple industry was seemingly gradually absorbed into the imperial monopoly under Diocletian, the private market that had previously sustained the city began to disappear. This can be explained through the fact that merchants likely had little reason to continue visiting Meninx once the opportunity to purchase purple textiles had been removed. Without this commercial incentive, the steady flow of imports that supported the city's population began to decline. The archaeological record reflects this shift clearly. Construction ceased, urban areas were gradually abandoned, and the city increasingly became dominated by industrial activity. The dye industry itself continued, but it now served imperial interests rather than the prosperity of the local community. In effect, Meninx lost the economic foundation that had originally allowed it to flourish. Meninx, therefore, represents a rare type of city within the Roman world, a highly specialized, almost mono-industrial-like center whose prosperity and eventual decline was directly tied to a single industry. The city was not simply a place where purple was produced, rather it functioned as a purple production center that had taken the form of a city. What the case of Meninx ultimately demonstrates is that urban economies in the Roman world could be far more specialized and far more dependent on industrial production, even if Mattingly's model has suggested that the agricultural base had always had to be present. Thus, in Meninx, purple dye did not merely color garments, it colored the development and the character of the city in which it was produced. Thank you so much.
Sorry that we don't have the ability to, well, I can't really unmute everyone and bring about the chaos of full applause, but that was excellent, Sam. Thank you. A very poetic way to sign off. Um, if anyone has a question, could you please use the react function to raise your hand, your virtual hand, or type it in the chat, of course, that's absolutely fine as well. I suppose sort of to start things off, I was interested. Would you say then the forgery, I suppose, of in terms of I suppose what the archaeological record produces in terms of how specialised Meninx's economy was? Um, would you say that fraudulent, counterfeit, alternative purple dyes are a sort of a wider symptom of, I suppose, that prosperity in the case of Meninx?
So the fraudulent purples, we have numerous recipes for them included in these Leiden and these Stockholm papyri. Now, it's not really clear to say where exactly all of them were produced. We do know that a different type of purple was, for instance, produced in Hierapolis in Asia Minor. But what you can most likely say is that um, as the scale of production and the demand for purple was so high during the Roman world, um, a lot of different um, cities must have profited off of it. But I think what is difficult for the production of other dyes is that purple dye production, as seen in Meninx, leaves a very clear archaeological record when it comes to these Murex shells. So that is a very easy way in which you can identify being produced there. If you have dyeing centers somewhere else, um, it could be possible that they were producing these counterfeit purples. However, it is very difficult to trace if you do not have these dyes present there. So determining that archaeologically, I think would be a lot more difficult than actually trying to determine these purple production centers themselves. Now, when it comes to fraudulent purples, by adding different substances to make the dye less potent but make it last longer, well, that would be abundantly clear for the people who were attempting to purchase these purples, as you can clearly see if a purple is more vibrant than the other. I think the only big one is the geographical location. I could imagine people trying to sell Tyrian purple from Tyre um, uh, that was actually from another location, but I do not think that it played really a fact in Meninx, as you can see in Pliny the Elder's description. Purple from Meninx was actually very highly praised. So I don't think that it really is the case here.
That's very interesting. Thank you. In